Picture two people standing in the same supermarket aisle, looking at the same shelf, reaching for the same product. They are neighbors. They live 2 blocks apart. They shop at the same store every week. And yet, at the register, one of them pays roughly 40% less than the other for a cart that contains more food. Not because they used a different coupon app, not because they caught a sale that the other person missed, because they are operating from an entirely different framework for how grocery shopping works. A framework that was not developed by a personal finance blogger or a frugality influencer, but by a tradition that has been thinking seriously about the economics of feeding a family for approximately 3,000 years. The neighbor paying full price does not know the framework exists. The neighbor paying 40% less has never thought of it as a strategy at all. It is simply how their family has always shopped, how their mother shopped, how their grandmother shopped in a market in Warsaw, or Marrakech, or Thessaloniki before that. The method is older than supermarkets. It is older than grocery stores. It is older than the concept of a fixed price on a consumer product. And today we are going to break it down completely. Every component, every principle, every specific practice that makes it work. Because the financial implications of applying it across a lifetime of household grocery spending are not a small number. To understand why Jewish communities developed such a distinctive approach to food purchasing, you need to understand the specific economic conditions that forged it. For most of the last 2,000 years, Jewish communities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East operated under conditions of permanent economic uncertainty. Legal restrictions on property ownership, periodic expulsions, arbitrary taxation, and the constant reality that accumulated assets could be seized with little warning. Under those conditions, the household budget was not an abstract planning exercise. It was a survival instrument. Every purchase that could be made more efficiently was a purchase that left more margin for the inevitable bad week. Every unit of food that could be preserved rather than discarded was a unit that did not need to be purchased again. And the weekly obligation of Shabbat, the requirement to feed the family properly regardless of the week's economic performance, meant that grocery efficiency was not optional. You had to find a way to make the budget work. Failure was not abstract. It arrived at the table on Friday night. The Talmud, characteristically, has something precise and practical to say about this. The tractate Bava Metzia, which deals extensively with commercial law and marketplace ethics, contains detailed discussion of onia'ah, the prohibition on price fraud. The rabbis established that charging more than 1/6 above the fair market price for a commodity constitutes a legally actionable wrong. The implication is significant. Knowing the fair market price of what you are buying is not just a practical skill in Jewish tradition. It is a moral prerequisite for commercial participation. You are expected to know what things cost, not approximately, actually. The community that internalizes that expectation produces shoppers who are not passive recipients of whatever price is on the shelf. They are active participants in a commercial negotiation, armed with real price knowledge and culturally authorized to act on it. That is the foundation on which everything else is built. The first practice is what might be called the price anchor system. The habit of knowing, before entering any store, the actual market price of every item on the shopping list. In Jewish market culture, from the shuk of Jerusalem to the covered markets of Morocco to the pushcart markets of the Lower East Side in the early 20th century New York, prices were never simply accepted. They were known, compared, and negotiated. A housewife shopping on Hester Street in 1910 knew to the penny what chicken cost at every pushcart on the block, what the going rate for potatoes was that week, and which vendor was running slightly above market and could therefore be negotiated down. That knowledge was not gathered casually. It was gathered systematically, as a matter of weekly practice, and it was shared within the community so that everyone operated from the same price intelligence. The modern equivalent is not complicated. Knowing the per-unit price of every staple the household regularly purchases, tracking that price across time and across stores, and never buying at a price significantly above the established baseline without a specific reason. The Jewish market tradition built this into the culture. Most modern shoppers have never developed it at all, which is precisely why supermarkets can charge what they charge, and almost nobody questions it. The second practice is the separation of the shopping list into categories based on price sensitivity, an approach that sounds technical until you understand how naturally the Jewish household framework produces it. Not all grocery items respond equally to comparison shopping, seasonal buying, or bulk purchasing. Staples: dried beans, lentils, rice, flour, sugar, oil, salt, have predictable prices, long shelf lives, and significant bulk discounts. These are the items worth buying in quantity when prices are low, storing carefully, and drawing from over weeks or months. Fresh produce and protein are more volatile in price, more seasonal, and more perishable. These require a different strategy, built around buying what is abundant and cheap rather than buying what the recipe calls for and paying whatever the market demands that week. The Jewish kitchen's historical flexibility, its capacity to build meals around what was available and affordable rather than around a fixed menu, is not just a culinary virtue, it is a purchasing strategy. A cook who decides the menu after seeing what is cheap at the market that day will consistently spend less than one who decides the menu first and then buys the required ingredients at whatever price they happen to be. The Shabbat cooking tradition, which involves building dishes around dried legumes, cheap cuts, and preserved ingredients, is at its economic core a strategy for purchasing flexibility, the ability to make something genuinely good from whatever the market is currently making cheap. The third practice is the gemach applied to food, the community infrastructure for sharing, distributing, and collectively purchasing food resources that reduces the per-household cost of feeding a family substantially. In traditional Jewish communities, the gemach extended well beyond interest-free loans into every category of household resource. Food gemachs, community pantries, collective buying arrangements, systems for distributing surplus from households with excess to households with need, existed in virtually every functioning Jewish community of sufficient size. The economic logic is the economics of bulk purchasing applied communally. A single household buying a 50-pound bag of flour captures a modest bulk discount and may struggle to use it before it goes stale. 10 households splitting a 500-pound order from a wholesaler capture a dramatically larger discount, divide the quantity into manageable portions, and pay a fraction of the retail price per unit. The communal buying arrangements that existed informally in Jewish neighborhoods, where trusted community members coordinated bulk orders for staples and distributed them among participating households, are functionally identical to what modern food co-ops have only recently rediscovered as an innovation. Jewish communities were operating them as standard practice centuries earlier, not as a political statement about food systems, but as a straightforward application of collective purchasing power to a household budget problem. The fourth practice is what the Jewish tradition calls Hachana, preparation, applied specifically to grocery purchasing rather than just to cooking. We have discussed Hachana in previous videos as the comprehensive Friday preparation for Shabbat, but its purchasing dimension is worth understanding separately. The Shabbat meal planning that Hachana requires forces a level of advanced purchase planning that most modern households never practice. When you know, by Wednesday, exactly what you will cook for Friday night dinner and Saturday lunch, because the menu is partly determined by tradition, partly by what is in the pantry from last week's shopping, and only marginally by impulse or novelty, you shop from a list built against a plan rather than from a vague sense of what might be needed. And shopping from a plan built against a real menu produces a fundamentally different grocery bill than shopping from a general list, or worse, shopping without a list at all. Consumer research consistently shows that unplanned purchases account for between 40 and 60% of total grocery spending for households that shop without specific lists against specific meal plans. The household that shops from a Shabbat-driven weekly plan, with every Friday meal and Saturday meal specified in advance, and a pantry stocked from prior bulk purchases, is structurally protected against the impulse spending category that consumes nearly half the grocery budget of the average household. And that protection is worth more than any coupon. The fifth practice is the Jewish approach to protein purchasing, which is rooted in kashrut, but produces economic behavior that makes extraordinary financial sense regardless of the religious dimension. The kashrut laws governing meat, requiring specific slaughter, specific inspection, and separation from dairy, historically made kosher meat more expensive per pound than non-kosher meat in most markets. This created a cultural adaptation that has significant economic implications. Jewish cooking developed an extraordinary repertoire of preparations that use meat as flavoring and seasoning rather than as the primary bulk of the dish. Cholent uses a relatively small quantity of cheap fatty meat, short ribs, brisket, marrow bones, distributed across a large volume of beans and barley. Alm stuffed cabbage uses ground meat extended with rice to produce a dish that contains perhaps 2 ounces of meat per serving, but tastes substantially more meat-forward than that ratio suggests. Chopped liver uses organ meat, the cheapest category of protein available at any butcher, transformed by the addition of schmaltz and caramelized onion into something that tastes considerably more luxurious than its ingredient cost implies. The Jewish kitchen's skill at making a small amount of expensive protein feed a large number of people generously is not a compromise. It is a technique, and it is a technique with a direct and calculable effect on the weekly grocery bill that operates independently of any religious motivation. As the 6th practice is seasonal buying, the discipline of purchasing produce and protein at its peak seasonal abundance, when prices are lowest and quality is highest, rather than purchasing whatever the supermarket happens to be, stocking at whatever price it happens to be charging. This is one of the oldest principles in the Jewish market tradition, and it was enforced not just by economics, but by the Jewish calendar itself. The autumn harvest cycle that preceded winter, during which Jewish households purchased and preserved large quantities of seasonal produce, was both a religious preparation relating to the harvest holidays of Sukkot and the transition into winter, and a purchasing strategy. Buying cucumbers by the bushel in late summer when they are cheap and abundant, and fermenting them into pickles that will serve the household through winter is a straightforward arbitrage between the summer price and the winter price of that vegetable. The Jewish household was not doing this because it read a financial planning article. It was doing it because the tradition had transmitted the knowledge, through generations of mothers and grandmothers, that the summer cucumber and the winter cucumber were priced in different universes, and that the intelligent response was to buy in the summer universe and consume through the winter. The 7th practice is the pushcart and the shuck, the Jewish tradition of market engagement that is active rather than passive. The fixed-price supermarket where products sit on shelves labeled with prices that are not subject to discussion is historically an anomaly. For most of recorded commercial history, prices were negotiated. The Jewish market tradition, from the shuck of the Middle East to the covered markets of medieval Europe, to the street markets of the Pale of Settlement, to the pushcart economy of immigrant New York, developed a culture of price engagement that is now almost entirely lost in mainstream consumer life. The pushcart vendors of Hester Street and Orchard Street on the Lower East Side in the early 20th century operated in a market where every transaction involved a negotiation, where the buyer was expected to know the fair price and to advocate for it, and where a vendor who tried to charge above market to an informed buyer would lose not just that transaction, but their reputation in the community. The community's collective price knowledge, shared informally through relationships, through the network of neighbors and family members who had shopped the same vendors that week, was the enforcement mechanism that kept prices honest. You could not overcharge the Jewish grandmother, who had already checked 4 other vendors and knew exactly what the going rate was, and who was going to tell 6 other people about it at synagogue on Saturday. The 8th practice is the dairy economy, the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition's extraordinary culinary reliance on dairy products as a protein source, which is rooted in kashrut, but whose economic logic is independent of it. Dairy protein, eggs, cheese, sour cream, butter, milk, is substantially cheaper per gram of protein than meat protein in virtually every market in the world. The Jewish culinary tradition, which developed an entire cuisine category of dairy dishes to fill the Shabbat and holiday meals where meat was not being served, produced a repertoire of preparations: blintzes, kugels, cheesecake, latkes, dairy soups, that extract maximum satisfaction and nutrition from the cheapest category of animal protein available. A Friday night dairy dinner, built around eggs, farmer's cheese, and sour cream, can feed 10 people for considerably less than a meat dinner of equivalent generosity. And in the Jewish culinary tradition, it is not considered inferior or frugal. It is simply a different category of meal with its own specific dishes and its own specific pleasures. The ability to alternate fluidly between meat meals and dairy meals, with a complete and satisfying culinary repertoire for each, All gives the Jewish household a purchasing flexibility that households with a single protein category simply do not have. The ninth practice is the art of the pantry, the maintenance of a well-stocked reserve of shelf-stable ingredients that allows the household to decouple its purchasing decisions from its cooking decisions. The Jewish pantry, stocked with dried beans and lentils, rice and barley, preserved vegetables, dried mushrooms, oils and vinegars, dried fruits and nuts, is not a backup supply. It is the primary infrastructure of the kitchen. When the pantry is well stocked, the weekly shopping trip is not about acquiring the ingredients for the week's meals. It is about replenishing what has been used and capitalizing on what is currently cheap. The household with a full pantry can buy chicken when chicken is on sale, store it in the freezer, and not buy chicken again until the next sale. It can buy flour in 50-pound bags when the price is right and not think about flour for months. It can build the week's meals from what the pantry contains, supplemented by whatever fresh produce looks best and cheapest at the market that week, rather than starting from a fixed menu and buying the required ingredients at current prices. The pantry is a purchasing buffer, a tool for decoupling what you need from when you buy it, so that buying always happens at the price you choose rather than at the price the market imposes on you this week, because you happen to need it this week. The 10th practice is the relationship with the vendor, the specific Jewish tradition of building ongoing commercial relationships with specific suppliers that produce preferential pricing, advance notice of sales and surplus, and access to product that never reaches the public-facing shelf. In the Jewish market tradition, the relationship between a housewife and her regular butcher, fishmonger, or produce vendor was not a transactional relationship. It was an ongoing commercial relationship with mutual obligations. The vendor knew what the household needed, held back suitable items, and offered preferential pricing to a reliable regular customer. The customer was loyal, paid promptly, and sent other community members to the same vendor. The economic value of that relationship, on both sides, was real and durable. Modern consumers have almost entirely abandoned this model. The anonymity of the supermarket makes it structurally impossible, but in any market with independent vendors, farmers markets, butcher shops, or ethnic grocery stores, the same logic applies. The customer who comes every week, knows what they want, pays without drama, and sends their neighbors is worth more to a small vendor than a dozen anonymous one-time buyers. And vendors communicate that value through pricing, through access, and through the kind of market intelligence, what's coming in, fresh tomorrow, what needs to move today, what the wholesale price was this week. That never appears on a shelf label. When you compare the conventional modern approach to grocery shopping with the Jewish framework, the behavioral difference is almost architectural. Most modern shoppers walk into a supermarket without a specific meal plan, without price anchor knowledge, without a well-stocked pantry that allows purchasing flexibility, without a community price intelligence network, without bulk buying arrangements, and without a relationship with any vendor that might produce preferential treatment. They respond to what is in front of them. The shelf arrangement, the promotional signage, the end cap displays, the products at eye level, all of which has been engineered at considerable expense by the supermarket to maximize spending rather than to serve the shopper's interest. The Jewish grocery framework, by contrast, enters the market with a plan, price knowledge, purchasing flexibility, community intelligence, and the cultural authorization to engage actively rather than passively. The supermarket's optimization budget runs into millions of dollars per store. The opposing framework is 3,000 years old, costs nothing to implement, and consistently wins. Here's the overlooked gem in all of this, and it is probably the most immediately actionable idea in this entire video. Of all the practices in the Jewish grocery framework, the single one that requires no community, no bulk buying arrangement, no special relationships, and no prior pantry infrastructure is the meal plan built backwards from what is cheap, rather than forwards from what you want to cook. Every week before shopping, the question is not, what do I want to make this week, and what do I need to buy? The question is, what is cheap and abundant this week, and what can I make from it? And that inversion, from demand-driven shopping to supply-driven cooking, is the engine of the Jewish kitchen's economy. It is what the Shuk housewife was doing when she checked prices at 5 stalls before buying anything. It is what the Friday preparation cycle enforces, when it builds the Shabbat menu around what is in the pantry and what is currently seasonal, rather than around a fixed recipe. It requires no special equipment, no special access, and no special knowledge beyond the basic culinary flexibility to cook from what is available rather than from what was decided in advance. And applied consistently every week, it reduces the grocery bill in a way that compounds silently across years into a number that will surprise you if you ever add it up. From the Talmud's Ona'ah principle establishing the moral obligation to know the fair price, to the Gamak's collective purchasing power, from the Hachana-driven meal planning that eliminates impulse spending, to the pantry infrastructure that decouples purchasing from cooking, Jewish families have demonstrated for 3,000 years that the gap between what groceries cost and what you pay for them is not fixed. It is a variable, one that responds directly to preparation, knowledge, community, and the willingness to engage with the market as an active participant rather than a passive consumer. In a world where grocery prices are climbing, where household food budgets are under pressure from every direction, and where the supermarket's entire physical and psychological architecture is engineered to extract maximum spending from the least informed shopper, the 3,000-year-old Jewish grocery framework is not a historical curiosity. It is a competitive advantage available to anyone willing to understand it and apply it. If you found value in exploring how Jewish traditions approach the practical economics of feeding a family, subscribe for more deep dives into the wisdom that these communities have been refining across generations. And if you've got your own experience with any of these methods, share it in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. And if there's one idea worth taking from all of this, know the price before you walk through the door, and never let the shelf decide for you.